Well, hi everybody, it's Pastor Brian, and if you were with us this past Sunday at Community Church, or if you saw the service online, then you know that I didn't get to quite finish what I had planned to share in the sermon. We just ran out of time. So we thought we would take what was left over and put it in this video for you, because this next Sunday we'll be on to new material in John chapter 6. So we're just going to take a minute and talk about this miracle of Jesus walking on water. It's in John chapter 6, verses 16 through 21. Again, if you were there on Sunday, you know we were talking about kind of another aspect of these miracle stories. The miraculous part is amazing. Jesus is God. He can do anything. But there are also other things going on in these stories. And we were focusing on the fact that they have a lot to teach us about what it means to be a servant of God. So with that in mind, I want to read this story and then just share a couple of thoughts about it. This is John 6, starting at verse 16. It says, "When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed 3.5 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were terrified. But he said to them, 'It is I, don't be afraid.' Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading." So again, another amazing miracle. Jesus does this thing once again that proves he's God. We know from the other Gospels that this is not only when Jesus walked on the water, but also invited Peter out onto the water. And Peter took a few steps in faith. Maybe you've heard sermons about this passage, this story, about what it means to have faith in God. But let me just point out two things that again have to do with what it means to serve God. First of all, let's remember who sent the disciples out in the boat on this journey across the lake. It was Jesus. Remember, Jesus is the one who said, "You guys go on ahead. I'm going to spend time alone with my Father, and I'll catch up with you later." So do you think that when he did that, Jesus knew this storm was coming? Of course he did. And yet he sent them out into it. Have you ever taken a step of obedience, done something you believe God would want you to do, and then things don't get easier? I certainly have. So here's another lesson about what it means to be a servant of God. I think we can safely say that sometimes serving God means sailing through some storms. Some people have this idea that if I've given my whole life to Jesus, then I won't have to deal with any more storms. That's obviously not the case. When our family was called by God, we believe, to leave our home, our church, our friends, and move here to Susanville in March of 2020, we didn't know that COVID-19 was coming. That was a storm that God knew was coming and sent us into for his own good purposes. But when that happens, when the wind starts to pick up, it's easy to think, man, did I do something wrong? Did I miss God's voice? Did I miss God's will? If you've ever felt that, then just please hear this. Maybe you didn't. Maybe you heard his voice clearly. You did exactly what you were supposed to do, because sometimes Jesus sends us into a storm. I wonder if these disciples were thinking, man, everything we've done lately has been for God. We went out in Jesus' name to cast out demons. We lived with strangers. We came back home, and on the first day of our vacation, we had to sit out in the hot sun and hand out bread to these ungrateful crowds. It's all been for God. And is this our reward? Being caught up in this storm, fearing for our lives? Did we do something wrong? Well, again, please hear. Maybe you didn't. Maybe you did nothing wrong. Sometimes Jesus calls us into hard places, into really challenging situations. Something I hear from believers actually a lot is this idea that there's always some kind of lesson in our suffering. And maybe even that if I can learn the lesson faster, then the suffering will be over faster. So I hear people saying, man, all this stuff I'm going through, I just wish I could figure out what the lesson is that God is trying to teach me. Kind of like there's some secret, there's some message they have to decode, and if they can figure it out, then maybe they'll get to move on to the next level or something. I have to tell you, I don't think it's a big mystery. I don't think there's a secret to discover. In those moments, I think God is trying to teach us one simple thing, which is to trust him in the storm. That's it. He's just saying, trust me in the storm. These things that have happened to you, they don't surprise me, they don't shock me, they don't disrupt my plans for your life. God's just saying, you're my servant, you got to trust me. It doesn't mean you're a bad servant. It doesn't mean that you've been slow to learn some lesson if he calls you to sail through a storm. So that's the first thing. But then in the middle of that storm, Jesus appears. And think about this, as far as they knew, they're way out in the middle of the lake where no one can help them. They took the only boat. Jesus is still back there on shore. So they assume that they are on their own in this storm. They're not going to have any help from anybody else. And then Jesus appears. He's right there. He just shows up. So were they ever really on their own? Were those obstacles that they saw really going to prevent Jesus from coming to their rescue? Well, of course not. There's never a place, there's never a time when Jesus can't reach us. So that's the other lesson I think to draw from this story, is that serving God means that Jesus is never very far away. And I would say that would be true of anyone. Anyone who cries out to God will find that he's never far away. But I would also say it is true in a unique way, in a special way, for those people who serve God, who've devoted their lives to him. If these disciples had any thought that, after all we've done for Jesus, now he's abandoned us, clearly that wasn't true. And we might think, well, that would be ridiculous of them. But sometimes don't we feel like, after I've been following Christ for all these years, in this situation, he seems to have abandoned me. What we can know is he hasn't. Of course he hasn't. He's right there. He's closer than you think. You are not alone in that storm, and he will not let the storm take you. He will not let it overcome you. So there you go. That's the story that we didn't get to look at on Sunday. Those are those 2 points of the outline for those of you who are note takers and you just got to fill in every blank. Serving God means sailing through a storm sometimes, but it also means that Jesus is right there with you in the midst of that. So please be on the lookout later this week for the Journey Through John video that has to do with next week's sermon, and we will see you on Sunday at 9 or 11.